History 102, Lecture on the 1960s, Part 1. If you're using the OpenStax chapters, well, you should be using the OpenStax books. Chapter is 29 and 30. If you're using the ushistory.org notes, it is 54 through 57. For historians and political scientists, the election of 1960 is an important election for several reasons. For historians, it's a kind of a transitional election between the 1950s, which we talked about, for the baby boom generation being more nostalgic, not ordered, an America that is ordered. Right, before the chaotic 60s, before the chaotic 1960s. Another important aspect of the election of 1960 that historians and political scientists like is this idea of image in politics. The election of 1960 really develops this idea of where the Republican and Democrat campaigns really try to bring TV into the campaign and use it effectively. In the election of 1960, the Republican Party nominates Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon has been Eisenhower's vice president for the last 8 years. The Democrat Party nominates John F. Kennedy. He has been a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts for several years, for 2 terms. Nixon and Kennedy represent kind of different aspects of the Cold War consensus that has developed since the beginning of the Cold War with Truman some years earlier. The highlight of the election in 1960 are the television debates between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. For historians and political scientists, this is kind of an early example of how image works in American politics. Polls taken at the time from people who watched the debates on television, they said Kennedy won. Kennedy was younger looking, taller. His campaign had him wear makeup, so in the black and white TV screen he didn't look washed out. He had a lighter colored suit that would contrast so starkly with the environment. There's a black and white TV is the predominant TV type in 1960, and so Kennedy was younger, more charismatic, kind of focused on short campaign slogan type statements. And so people that watched the debate argued, or the polls at the time said that Kennedy won the debates. What's interesting is polls were taken of people that listened to it on the radio, said that Nixon won the debates. Nixon gave longer answers, more in-depth answers. Nixon had a better handle on specifics, the issues of the day, but also what a Nixon administration would do. It was an extremely close election. John F. Kennedy pulls it out. An extremely close election. Like every election, accusations of fraud. And so I give you the next president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy's policies are called the New Frontier. In John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, he calls for America to go to the New Frontier, expand America. Fight the Cold War, defend American freedom against the communists. He also sets a goal for space. This is several years after Sputnik. And so Americans in 1960 feel that they're behind in the space race. We've lost ground against the Soviets, against world communism, and so John F. Kennedy urges America to have the goal of getting to the moon by the end of the decade. Another aspect of the Peace Corps, of this new frontier, this idea of the Peace Corps, of send young Americans abroad to help humanitarian projects around the world. There's a Cold War aspect to it too. When these people around the world meet young, impressionable, pretty, good-looking college students, they'll remember that. Hey, I want to be, the Americans helped me. So the Peace Corps in a Cold War context also argues for this idea of, you're trying to attract friends. When when it comes time to pick sides in the Cold War, you've done your humanitarian projects, but now, hopefully, these developing countries, called Third World at the time, but we call them developing countries today, will pick the Americans and liberal democracy and capitalism. One of the reasons given for Nixon's loss in the 1960 election is there is an economic downturn, 1959, 1960, and so one of John F. Kennedy's early economic policies is to get through Congress a tax cut so that Americans can have more of their money to get the economy going again. Kennedy foreign policy is an important part of the John F. Kennedy presidency, and honestly a big part of his legacy. When you study John F. Kennedy, historians generally love John F. Kennedy, and one of the legacies of John F. Kennedy that historians point to is his foreign policy. John F. Kennedy ran as being a Cold Warrior. He was going to fight the Cold War, and the Kennedy critique, the Kennedy campaign critique was in the election in 1960 was that the Eisenhower-Nixon administration were not fighting the Cold War well enough. The Soviets had gotten to space first. Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba in 1959. So for the Kennedy campaign, the Kennedy administration, they argued, and they won on that argument, that they would fight the Cold War better. They would defend American freedom better than the Eisenhower/Nixon administration did. Another strike against the Nixon campaign. In 1959, the CIA came out saying that there was a missile gap, that the Soviet Union had a vastly larger nuclear and conventional weapons arsenal than we did. The Kennedy campaign jumped on that the Eisenhower administration was so weak on fighting the communists that they allowed a missile gap to happen. Later historians, as you study the topic, there was not a missile gap. We were actually ahead, but the CIA, didn't interpret intelligence correctly. And so while the missile gap was not correct, historians today, when they look at the issue, we were actually a little ahead on nuclear weapons. If not in conventional weapons, we definitely had a much larger nuclear arsenal. But don't blame, I'm not saying blame John F. Kennedy's campaign for that. They didn't know that. And so I'm not saying blame the Kennedy administration. They didn't know that. The CIA just came out and said it. And so the Kennedy campaign jumps on it and makes that a big issue. Like, we will fight the Cold War better. We will fight the communists better. We'll bring freedom to the world more effectively than the Nixon administration will. And so that's one of the reasons given for Nixon's victory, was the perceived weakness of the Eisenhower administration. Probably the biggest, outside of Vietnam, the biggest issue, foreign policy-wise, for the Kennedy administration was the Bay of Pigs. Okay, what is the Bay of Pigs? It's a pig full of bays. No, or it's a bay full of pigs. No. Anyways, the Bay of Pigs is a large bay in Cuba. Okay. when you look at the geography of Cuba, there's an area of Cuba where Cuba kind of thins out, gets really thin because the bay cuts out a large part of Cuba, and it's called the Bay of Pigs. Okay. It's a little bit of a background. In the 40s and the 50s, the Cuban government, Cuba was run by a guy named Batista. Batista was a capitalist. He was pro-America, pro-capitalist. He was big on the American economy here. A little bit of Nevada history for you. Before Las Vegas was the number one place to go gambling in the Western Hemisphere. During the 50s, late 40s and the 50s, it was actually Cuba, Havana, Cuba, was the big place to go to gamble. And so the Batista regime, very, very pro-America. I mean, the American mafia comes in, sets up casinos, and so very capitalist. In the mid-50s, a revolutionary group forms, led by a man named Fidel Castro. He has his followers, his commanders. Another famous figure from this era would be Che Guevara. He's popular today for some people who don't understand who Che Guevara was, and so people put him on their shirts because they don't really know about Che Guevara. But anyways, so you have men like Che Guevara, Fidel Castro. They oppose the Batista regime. They are Marxist in that they like Karl Marx. They adhere to his economic philosophy of class struggle, the poor versus the middle class, the bourgeoisie. Fidel Castro leads his movement in a revolution against the Batista regime, and Fidel Castro comes to power in 1959. At first, he downplays his Marxism, but as he comes into power and he solidifies control of Cuba, he comes out more in favor of the Soviet Union and being a Marxist, a communist. The Eisenhower administration does not like this. The CIA and the Eisenhower administration, in 1959, 1960, as Fidel Castro's coming out as a Marxist, a communist, they start plotting to remove Fidel Castro. They're going to assassinate him and replace him. They're going to put the Batista regime back into power. So you see what was supposed to happen, right? What was supposed to happen was Nixon was supposed to win and then would carry on the Eisenhower administration's policies. One of them was to kill Castro, get rid of him. Well, ¿qué pasó? What happened? John F. Kennedy wins, becomes president. When Kennedy first takes office in January of 1961, he is told of this plan. The CIA has planned this invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. And what is supposed to happen is refugees from Cuba, people who left Cuba when Castro took over, hundreds of thousands of Cubans left and fled to Florida. Okay, and so what the Eisenhower administration was going to do was take a lot of these Cuban refugees that had fled communism. They did not want to be enslaved by a communist dictatorship, so they enslaved. So instead of being enslaved by Castro, they fled they fled to Florida. And the Eisenhower administration was going to take these refugees, and they were going to form an army, and they were going to go to Cuba and invade Cuba and take out the Castro administration. Initially, the Air Force was supposed to provide air support for these refugees, now an army. Okay. So that is the plan that Kennedy is given. Hey, listen, the other administration, we were starting this plan, we'd like you to pull it off. Throughout the 1960 election, Kennedy is accused of being soft on communism. Okay, and so to show that he's tough on fighting communists, the new President Kennedy decides to go ahead with this Bay of Pigs invasion. At the last minute, the Kennedy administration pulls air support. They don't want the Air Force involved in air support. So in April of 1961, thousands of Cuban refugees, now an army, are landed on the Bay of Pigs, or landed on the shore in the Bay of Pigs. It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Kennedy administration pulls Air Force support at the last minute because they don't want, they don't want people to think it was a sanctioned American military effort, right? Guess who shows up? Guess who showed up in the Bay of Pigs? Not people who had aided Castro, but the Cuban Revolutionary Army. These refugees are defeated. A bunch are taken hostage. They will be used for propaganda purposes. Okay, it's a black eye to the Americans. Castro makes massive mileage out of this idea. Look, the Yankees couldn't defeat me. The Norte Americanos, they couldn't overthrow me. Ha ha ha. Right, and I have all their hostages in jail in Cuban prisons because they couldn't get us out. It took several years of negotiating to get these people out. Okay. And so the Bay of Pigs is kind of an early black eye for the Kennedy administration. You have the Vienna Summit in the summer of 1961, August of 1961 to be exact. You have Kennedy meeting the Soviet leader Khrushchev for the first time. Generally in this summit, the media portrays Kennedy as weak, vacillating. He looked weak against the mighty Russian leader Khrushchev. And so it's another black guy to the Kennedy administration. We're not fighting the Cold War. We partially won. We would fight the Cold War better than the Eisenhower-Nixon administration did. And so there's another one. Another important event in August of 1961 is the Berlin Wall got put up. Right during the summit, East and West Berlin are separated by eventually a wall with barbed wire on either side and guards shooting people. Right. Next, you have the neutralization of Laos. Okay. So Kennedy's issue is this, right? We're knee deep in Vietnam. We've created South Vietnam. We're defending South Vietnam against the communist North Vietnamese. Well, Laos is having a communist revolution too. Okay, so just like in Vietnam, where North Vietnam communists and South Vietnam communists are trying to overthrow the South Vietnamese government, Laos is having an issue too. Laos is having a communist revolution too. And so the Kennedy administration has to decide, what do we do, right? We argued in the election of 1960, we argued that we would fight the Cold War better than the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, right? The Eisenhower administration allowed Castro to take power in Cuba, 90 miles away from Florida, right? Communists are at our doorsteps. Communists are only 90 miles away. And so the Kennedy administration needs to look tough. They need to solve something here. We're knee deep in Vietnam. We're defending the Vietnamese. We're defending the South Vietnamese government against Southern Vietnamese communists and the North Vietnamese communists called the Viet Cong. Okay. And so what are you going to do in Laos? Are we going to send troops? We're going to send advisors and troops to Laos? Are we going to give Laos the same attention as we are to South Vietnam? Okay. Historians generally credit Kennedy as successful with the neutralization of Laos. Instead of fighting the Cold War, so to speak, what did Kennedy do? Kennedy neutralized Laos. A compromise was reached. The Communist Revolution, the Pathet-Lao, P-A-T-H-E-T, Lao, L-A-O, the Pathet-Lao would stop their revolution if the prevailing ruling government allowed them some say in government. And so for historians that love John F. Kennedy, this is an example of successful foreign policy. You neutralized Laos. Yay! And for later historians who look at the tragedy of Vietnam, oh no. Okay. Laos stands out as an effort, a successful foreign policy effort to stop the communists, but also not drag the United States into an Asian war. Okay, into a war in an Asian country. Okay. And so the neutralization of Laos is viewed as a massive foreign policy win for the Kennedy administration. The last foreign policy thing, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is almost a legacy of the Kennedy administration. Lovers of John F. Kennedy, and most historians love John F. Kennedy. Lovers of Kennedy, this Cuban Missile Crisis, this is the high point of the Kennedy administration. Okay? This is the high point. In the summer of 1962, the CIA, they've been flying spy planes over Cuba, taking pictures of Cuba. In August of 1962 and September of 1962, the CIA discovers that the Soviet Union is building bases, military bases in Cuba, and it looks like it's going to be a nuclear weapons base. They're going to put nuclear weapons in Cuba. They get intelligence that the Soviets are planning on building a nuclear weapons base, already are building a nuclear weapons base in Cuba. And the CIA and the American military discovers that there is, in fact, on the way to Cuba in October of 1962, a Soviet convoy heading to Cuba, planning on putting nuclear weapons in Cuba. The Kennedy administration is alerted to this threat. For a couple of weeks in September and October of 1962, you have the Kennedy administration quietly deliberating. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about Cuba? The Soviets are in the process of putting nuclear weapons into Cuba. This cannot happen. We've got to stop it. Okay. The Cuban Missile Crisis is this tense 14-day standoff where President Kennedy decides he's going to announce to the American public that missiles are being put in Cuba and we're going to stop it. The Soviets are on their way to Cuba with nuclear missiles, and so there's going to be a standoff. It's a tense 14-day standoff in the Caribbean where American and Soviet warships face each other. Okay? What happens if the Soviets decide to try to run the blockade and put missiles in Cuba? Will the U.S. fire on those Soviet vessels? Okay? For historians of Kennedy, the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrates Kennedy's leadership, his integrity, his strength, his political acumen to assess the issues and avert nuclear war. For a lot of people who lived at the time, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we got to nuclear war. This is the closest we ever got to having a nuclear war because American and Soviet ships were facing each other in the Caribbean. Okay. The Cuban Missile Crisis ends when the Kennedy and Khrushchev administration decide to negotiate a deal. The Soviets agree to not put weapons in Cuba, nuclear weapons in Cuba. We promised to stop trying to kill Castro. We stopped trying to kill Castro, We agreed. We had previous years, we had put some missiles in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union. If you know your geography, Turkey borders Russia, and so we agreed to withdraw our missiles from Turkey. And so for historians, this is Kennedy at his height. This is the perfection of the Kennedy administration. He didn't get us into a war where 500,000 U.S. troops go in Vietnam like Lyndon Johnson. For historians, the progressive Kennedy is this is why Kennedy is a fantastic president. Okay. And this is the end of part 1.